Good morning. Thanks for joining us for 10 minutes to discuss how you can support well-being within your team and also for yourself. I'm Carolyn Cumsty-Fowler, Senior Director for Nursing Wellbeing of the Johns Hopkins Health System. And I'm delighted to be joining Dr. Rich Safir, the Chief Medical Director of Employee Health and Wellbeing at Johns Hopkins Medicine, on this journey. And I invite you, before we start, to really just commit to single tasking, avoiding the distractions that come with all the other things we might do during this time, and give yourself the gift of 10 minutes of undisturbed focus, which is really good for your well-being. This week, we are returning to the building block of leadership support, and specifically, we're going to be thinking about how we role model as leaders, especially in the area of self-care behaviors and well-being. I'd like to start by sharing my favorite leadership quote from John Maxwell. Leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. The question many of us ask, though, is how do I influence, and specifically, how do I influence well-being? Before we get to that, let me show you another pretty thought-provoking quote from Dr. Albert Schweitzer. Example is not the main thing in influencing others. It's the only thing. Let's just take a few seconds for that to sink in. Example is not the main thing in influencing others. It's the only thing. As managers and leaders, we influence whether we mean to or not. And so here's another question to consider. Is influencing the people we lead the same as being a role model? Well, let's go to a definition. Definition of a role model is a person whose behavior in a particular role is imitated by others. So it's behavioral. It's not what we say, it's what we do. Let's reflect for a moment and think about whose picture belongs in this photograph frame. As you think about your role models at work and who's the people whose behaviors you hope to imitate, who is this person? And as you bring their face to mind, like, what do you feel? If your role model is like my role model, I have a sense of warmth. It feels positive to me. It brings a smile to my face. And so, for me, a role model is somebody really positive. However, the challenge with role modeling for well-being is that as leaders, we influence whether we're planning to or not. So we're basically on all the time. And our intentions and our impact may actually not match. For example, if through my work ethic and my professional choices, I intend to model accountability, efficiency, effectiveness, responsiveness to emails and communication, and commitment to my team and the patients and the families we serve, that feels like a good thing to model to me. But my impact may be different. People may look at us going above and beyond and see people who are driven or relentless or perhaps are stronger or more capable or more competent than they are. People who watch us doing that may feel less than, and that's not our intention. Similarly, I may intend to model self-control, selflessness, courage, calm. But that may be interpreted as being invincible or out of touch or superhuman, and it may actually dissuade people from doing the self-care and asking for the help that they need. We've been socialized to admire the can-do people. We've been told that self-sacrifice is part of this job that we signed up for. And friends, I'm going to really invite you to join in a journey with me, which is being the group of people who says this story is not working for us. And I'd like to offer you a resource because role modeling well-being asks us to unlearn the lessons about self-sacrifice and self-care being selfish or inconsistent with a clinical work environment. Our goal is to normalize the idea of practicing self-care at work. This is a brief article that I wrote for closela.org. It may be a helpful resource for you. I describe how we dismantle this myth and a couple of things we can do. And Tara's going to put the link to this article in the chat for you. So let's now think about how we can influence the well-being of our staff by role modeling self-care. Influence, of course, always starts with our own practice. And we also need to bring a little humility to this, because what works for me for self-care may not work for other people. We all have preferred activities. And so while we want to role model self-care, we don't want to impose our personal self-care choices on everybody. Now, one way that I like to think about self-care is in two broad groups. On the one hand, we have a set of activities that are what I call the basic needs self-care. That's water, food, bathroom breaks, taking a break. Those are the primary needs that keep us sort of well enough to do our jobs. The second broader group that I think of is what I call the balancing self-care. Self-care activities that balance our energy and our nervous system. And the ability to practice that starts with the question of me saying, well, okay, let me just pause for a moment and notice how I feel. But it starts with the question, what do I need in this moment? Now, if when you ask yourself that question, you find that you're feeling, anxious, overloaded, stressed, then maybe a self-care practice that is a calming practice would help you, such as breathing, grounding yourself in the present moment, maybe finding a place where it's quiet, or you can turn the light off and just be in the dark for a moment, and focusing on what you've accomplished already today. If, on the other hand, you find that you're feeling tired and low energy, maybe a little unmotivated, then maybe something energizing would serve you well. A quick walk, climbing some stairs, getting outside and looking at the daylight, 60 seconds of dancing. And I have seen colleagues in clinical units putting on some music and just dancing for 60 seconds. Maybe some stretching, sharing a funny story with a colleague. Whatever it is, just connecting to something that charges your batteries. The key here is that we need to make whatever it is we do visible. So our goal as managers and leaders is to model self-care at work intentionally and daily. Because even though I have self-care practices that I do when I'm not at work to support my well-being, such as making my bedroom a no-tech zone to support deep sleep, pre-packing lunches each evening so that I can bring the next day, perhaps getting up a little earlier to exercise or do some mindfulness practice. If I don't share them, they can't influence the well-being of the people that I care about at work. So I invite you to ask yourself this question. What will I do to care for my well-being today that is visible to those I lead? What will I do or what will I share so that they know that I'm invested both in my self-care and in theirs? And because you've just invested this time in being at a talk on well-being, I invite you to think about one thing you can do this afternoon to support your self-care that will be visible to those you lead. So let's share some tips. I have 3 tips for you today. The first is to set a timer on your phone for 1-minute self-care check-ins. If you've never done this before, maybe doing it 1 or 2 or 3 hours a day will be enough. But ultimately, our goal would be to set a timer for every hour that we're at work so that we're able to pause, notice how we're feeling, and do something even for 1 minute on self-care. And I call these our self-care snacks. No calories, no sodium, no guilt, just self-care. The second is to share self-care strategies with your team. And this is about making self-care visible and inviting other people to share their own self-care, call that out, discuss it, provide maybe some motivation and inspiration for each other. And my final tip for today is to notice the self-care is selfish story. Now, I'm not asking you now to challenge it or to shut it down. That's not the point. What I'm asking you to do is to notice when that self-care is selfish message shows up in your own brain, shows up in the brain of other people, shows up in conversations. What we're wanting to do is just to turn the volume down on it. That's all. Before you go today, could you please just do us the favor of answering 2 questions of the link that Tara will put in the chat? In next week's topic, we're starting norms, the building block of norms, and Dr. Sophia will introduce us to that content. As always, we invite you to connect with Healthy at Hopkins and the Office of Wellbeing. So many resources on this site. But if when you're going through the resources, you find that something you would hope to see there is missing, please let us know and we'll do our best to make sure that whatever you need is put up there. Thank you so very much for joining us today.